found the hospital bracelet on the Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after we buried Mom. Claire and I had been sorting through boxes in the attic, dividing up photo albums and baby clothes neither of us could bear to throw away. The summer heat made the cramped space feel like an oven, and dust floated through the single shaft of light from the small window. We'd been working in relative silence, both exhausted from grief. The bracelet was tucked inside a shoebox filled with old greeting cards and receipts. It was small, plastic, the kind they put on newborns in the hospital. The edges had yellowed with age, but the text was still perfectly legible. I held it up to the light, expecting to see my name or Claire's, maybe a sweet memento Mom had saved from one of our births. Instead, I saw a name I didn't recognize. Baby Girl Monroe, it read. The date was April 3rd, 1992. I was born in May of 1992, and our last name was Hartley. My hands started shaking before my brain could fully process why. I called Claire over, my voice coming out strangled and strange. She was on the other side of the attic, sorting through Mom's old teaching supplies. When she saw what I was holding, she barely glanced at it before returning to her box. Her lack of reaction made my stomach twist. I'd expected confusion, curiosity, anything but this casual indifference to something that felt earth-shattering. She said it was probably from one of Mom's students. Mom had taught elementary school for 30 years, and she sometimes brought home things from the lost and found, or kept mementos from former students. It was a reasonable explanation, one that should have satisfied me, but my heart was pounding too hard, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling as I stared at that tiny bracelet. The date bothered me most. April 1992, just 1 month before I was born. And the name, Monroe. I'd never heard Mom mention anyone named Monroe. I turned the bracelet over, looking for anything else, any other clue. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written a number. It looked like a phone number. I sat down hard on an old trunk, still clutching the bracelet. Claire was talking about what we should do with Mom's Christmas decorations, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. The number on the back of the bracelet was local, with the same area code we'd grown up with. My mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Why would Mom have this? Why would she keep it hidden in a shoebox? I interrupted Claire mid-sentence and showed her the number. She squinted at it, then shrugged and said it was probably disconnected after all these years. She wanted to know if I was keeping the vintage ornaments or if she could have them. Her practicality, usually one of her best qualities, was infuriating me now. How could she not see that this mattered? But maybe I was being irrational. Maybe grief was making me paranoid, seeing mysteries where there were none. Mom had just died. We were both exhausted and emotionally raw. Still, I slipped the bracelet into my pocket. I'd call the number later, when I was alone, just to satisfy my curiosity and put this strange unease to rest. I waited until I got home that night to dial the number. My apartment felt too quiet after the busy day in the attic, and I kept thinking about that bracelet. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I should just throw it away and forget about it. Instead, I sat on my couch and dialed, expecting to hear a disconnected number message or someone confused about why a stranger was calling. A woman answered on the third ring. Her voice was older, rough around the edges, like she'd been a smoker. When I stammered out an explanation about finding an old hospital bracelet with this number, there was a long pause, so long that I thought she'd hung up. Then she asked my name, and something in her tone made my skin prickle with goosebumps. I told her. Another pause, even longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was shaking. She asked if my mother's name was Elizabeth Hartley. Yes, I said, my heart hammering. The woman took a breath, and I could hear it catch in her throat. She asked if I could come see her tomorrow. She had something to tell me about my mother. The woman's name was Patricia Monroe. She lived across town in a neighborhood I'd only driven through a handful of times. She gave me her address and asked me to come alone, which sent alarm bells ringing in my head. But something in her voice, something desperate and sad, made me agree. I didn't sleep much that night, staring at the ceiling and imagining a dozen different scenarios. I didn't tell Claire about the phone call. I wasn't sure why, except that her dismissiveness earlier had stung. We'd always been close, always shared everything, but lately I felt like we were drifting apart. Or maybe I'd never really known her the way I thought I did. The thought made me feel guilty. Mom had just died, and here I was, chasing some mystery instead of grieving with my sister. But I couldn't let it go. Something about that hospital bracelet, about Patricia Monroe's reaction to my name, about the way she'd asked about Mom. It all felt significant, heavy, like I was standing on the edge of something that would change everything once I stepped forward. I just didn't know what yet. Patricia Monroe's house was small, with peeling paint and an overgrown garden. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before gathering the courage to walk up to her door. When she answered, I saw a woman in her 70s with gray hair and tired eyes. She looked at me for a long moment before stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled like coffee and old newspapers. She led me to a living room crowded with outdated furniture and framed photographs. She offered me coffee, which I declined because my stomach was already churning. We sat in awkward silence for a moment before she asked again about my mother. I told her Mom had died 3 weeks ago, and Patricia's face crumpled. She'd looked up the obituary after I called, she admitted. She'd known. I asked her how she knew Mom. Patricia stared at her hands, twisting a tissue between her fingers. She said they'd known each other a long time ago, during a difficult period in both their lives. I waited, my heart pounding. Then she looked up at me with eyes full of tears and said the words that would shatter everything I knew. She said she was the one who gave birth to me. I stood up so fast I knocked over a side table. A lamp crashed to the floor, but neither of us moved to pick it up. My ears were ringing, and I could barely hear my own voice as I said, that was impossible. Elizabeth Hartley was my mother. I had baby pictures with her, pregnant. I had memories of her telling me about my birth. Patricia was mistaken, or lying, or delusional. But Patricia just sat there, crying quietly, shaking her head. She said she knew this would be hard to hear. She'd known for 31 years that this day might come, and she'd been terrified of it. But when I'd called about the bracelet, she knew she couldn't keep lying. Not anymore. Not when Elizabeth was gone and couldn't be hurt by the truth coming out. I demanded proof. My voice came out harsh, almost cruel, but I couldn't help it. This woman was claiming to be my biological mother, and I needed more than just her word. Patricia nodded and stood up slowly, like her joints hurt. She walked to a bookshelf and pulled down a photo album. She handed it to me with trembling hands. The album was old, the kind with sticky pages and plastic covers. Patricia sat back down and waited while I opened it. The first page showed a very young woman, probably 19 or 20, with dark hair and my exact nose. She was pregnant in some of the photos, her belly swollen under loose dresses. The date stamps on the photos said 1992, my birth year. I flipped through more pages, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn them. There were hospital photos. The young Patricia in a hospital bed, exhausted and pale, holding a tiny newborn with a bracelet on her wrist. I looked closer at the bracelet in the photo, and my vision blurred. Baby Girl Monroe. The same bracelet I'd found in the attic yesterday. Patricia was talking now, her words spilling out fast, like she'd been holding them in for decades. She'd been young and alone, she said. The baby's father had left when he found out she was pregnant. She had no money, no support, no way to care for a child. And then Elizabeth had offered her a solution, a way out that would help both of them.
Elizabeth couldn't have children, Patricia explained. She and my father had tried for years, gone through fertility treatments, suffered through miscarriages. They were desperate for a baby. When Patricia got pregnant, Elizabeth was her nurse at the clinic where she went for prenatal care. They'd started talking. Elizabeth had been kind to her when no one else was. She'd helped Patricia get food stamps and find a place to stay. And then Elizabeth had made a proposal. She would adopt the baby privately, give her everything Patricia couldn't. She'd make sure the child had a good life, a real family, 2 parents who loved her. In exchange, Patricia would walk away completely. No contact, no visits, no claims. It would be like she'd never existed. The baby would be Elizabeth's in every way that mattered. Patricia had agreed. She was desperate and scared and saw no other option. Elizabeth had arranged everything privately, avoiding official adoption channels. She'd worn maternity clothes, told everyone she was pregnant, even taken time off work. When Patricia gave birth, Elizabeth took the baby home and registered the birth with herself as the mother. No one ever questioned it. It was a different time, Patricia said. Things were easier to hide back then. I found my voice and asked about my father. Dad, the man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped with my homework. Did he know? Patricia's face softened slightly. No, she said. Elizabeth had kept it from him, too. She'd told him she was pregnant, let him believe the baby was biologically theirs. He'd been so happy, so excited, that she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. So Dad had no idea. He'd died 2 years ago, believing I was his biological daughter. The thought made me feel sick. He'd never known, and now he never would. I could never ask him questions, never see his reaction, never know if he would have loved me the same if he'd known the truth. That chance was gone, stolen by Mom's deception. I asked about Claire, my sister, my only sibling, the person I'd grown up with and shared everything with. Patricia shook her head. Claire was their biological daughter, born 3 years after me. Elizabeth had gotten pregnant naturally, a miracle the doctors couldn't explain. So Claire really was my half-sister, not my full sister. We'd shared a mother, but not genetics. The symmetry I'd always felt between us had been an illusion. I asked Patricia why she kept the bracelet if she was supposed to walk away completely. She looked down at her hands again, that tissue shredded between her fingers. She said Elizabeth had given it to her, a small mercy. One tiny memento of the daughter she'd carried for 9 months and held for just a few hours before signing away. Patricia had kept it all these years, hidden in her own home, a secret reminder of what she'd done. But then, how did it end up in Mom's attic? Patricia looked confused. She didn't know. She'd never given it back to Elizabeth, never had contact with her after that day in the hospital. It had always been here, in her house. Unless... Her face went pale. Unless Elizabeth had come back for it at some point,
or Patricia had given her something else and misremembered. Memory was tricky after so many years. I pulled the bracelet from my pocket and set it on the coffee table between us. Patricia stared at it like it was a ghost. She reached out with trembling fingers and picked it up, holding it to the light exactly as I had the day before. Then she started crying harder, deep sobs that shook her whole body. She said she thought she'd lost this years ago. She couldn't understand how I'd found it. My mind was reeling. If Patricia still had her bracelet, or thought she did, then whose bracelet had I found? Patricia wiped her eyes and stood up again, walking down a hallway. I heard a closet door open, the sound of boxes being moved. She came back a few minutes later carrying a small wooden box, the kind people use for jewelry. She opened it on the coffee table. Inside was another hospital bracelet. Baby Girl Monroe. The same name, the same date. But this one was different. Slightly different plastic, a different shade of yellow from age. Patricia picked it up and held it next to the one I'd brought. They were similar, but not identical. 2 bracelets for the same baby. But that didn't make sense. Hospitals only gave 1 bracelet. Why would there be 2? Patricia looked as confused as I felt. She said she'd only ever had 1 bracelet, the one from the hospital. She'd never seen this other one before. I told her I'd found mine in Mom's attic, hidden in a shoebox with old cards and receipts. Patricia's expression changed then, shifting from confusion to something else. Recognition, maybe, or realization. She asked me what else was in the box. I tried to remember. There'd been so much stuff in the attic, so many boxes. The shoebox had contained mostly old greeting cards, some with dates from the early 90s, birthday cards, congratulations cards, that sort of thing. A few receipts from baby stores. Nothing that had seemed significant at the time, just the normal detritus of raising children. I'd barely paid attention to anything else once I'd seen the bracelet. Patricia asked if I still had the box. I told her no, it was still at Mom's house. She said we needed to go look at it together. There was something she was remembering, something she hadn't thought about in years. When she'd given birth to me, there had been another woman in the maternity ward. Another single mother, another baby girl born the same day. The other woman's baby had died a few hours after birth. The words hung in the air between us. I felt cold despite the warm afternoon. Patricia was staring at nothing, her eyes distant as she pulled up memories from 3 decades ago. She said she remembered Elizabeth being very interested in that other mother, talking to her, spending time with her. At the time, Patricia had thought it was just Elizabeth being kind, doing her job as a nurse. But now she was wondering if there had been more to it. We drove to Mom's house in silence. I was behind the wheel, but I barely remembered the route. My mind was spinning with implications I didn't want to consider. Patricia sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. Neither of us wanted to voice what we were both thinking. It was too horrible, too unthinkable. But the pieces were fitting together in a way that made terrible sense. The house felt different now. No longer the warm home of my childhood, but a place filled with secrets. Claire's car wasn't in the driveway, thank God. I wasn't ready to see her yet. Wasn't ready to explain what I was doing or who Patricia was. I used my key to let us in, and we climbed the stairs to the attic. The heat was oppressive, but I barely noticed it. The shoebox was exactly where I'd left it. I brought it down and spread its contents on the floor. Patricia knelt beside me, sorting through the cards with shaking hands. Most were congratulations cards for the new baby, me, dated May 1992. But tucked at the bottom was a sympathy card. In memory of your loss. Patricia opened it and read the signature inside. The color drained from her face. The sympathy card was signed Jennifer Monroe. Patricia's maiden name had been Monroe, too. She said Jennifer was her cousin, though they hadn't been close. Jennifer had been at the same hospital in April 1992, giving birth on the same day as Patricia. Patricia hadn't known until later, until Elizabeth had mentioned it. Such a sad coincidence, Elizabeth had said. 2 cousins having babies on the same day, but only one baby surviving. Jennifer's daughter had been stillborn. Patricia remembered hearing about it, how devastating it had been. Jennifer had been even younger than Patricia, only 17. She disappeared after that, left town and never came back. Patricia had tried to find her a few years later, feeling guilty that she'd given up her healthy baby while Jennifer had lost hers. But Jennifer had vanished, and no one in the family knew where she'd gone. I was staring at the bracelet in my hand, the one I'd found in the attic. The pieces were coming together now, forming a picture so disturbing I wanted to reject it completely. 2 Baby Girl Monroes, born the same day. 2 cousins, 2 babies. 1 dead, 1 very much alive. And Mom, Elizabeth, right in the middle of it all. Patricia said what I was thinking. She asked if it was possible that Elizabeth had taken both babies, that she'd arranged the private adoption with Patricia, taking her baby legally, but then also taken Jennifer's baby, the one everyone thought had died, that she'd kept both babies but only registered 1 birth, mine, using the dead baby's hospital records to make it look legitimate. 2 babies, but only 1 on paper. It would explain the 2 bracelets. 1 from Patricia's healthy baby, 1 from Jennifer's baby, who might not have been dead at all. But where was the other baby now? Who was she? My head was spinning with the implications. Patricia's face was white with shock and horror. She kept saying she'd held her baby. She'd seen her alive. She couldn't have been Jennifer's. But she'd only held her for a few hours before Elizabeth took her. I thought about Claire, my sister, 3 years younger than me, or so we'd always believed. I pulled out my phone and searched for Claire's birth certificate details in my files. She'd been born in May 1992, according to her official records, the same month as me. But that was impossible. We were supposed to be 3 years apart. I showed Patricia the information. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. I was adopted in April 1992, according to what Patricia had just told me. Claire was supposedly born in May 1995, but her birth certificate said May 1992. That would make us only 1 month apart in age, not 3 years. I thought back to every birthday party, every year of school, the way Claire had always seemed so much younger than me, except she'd never looked it. People always said we could be twins, that we looked so similar despite the age gap. I pulled up photos on my phone, pictures of Claire and me together. We did look alike, same dark hair, same nose, same chin. I'd always attributed it to being sisters, to sharing Mom and Dad's genes. But if we were both Patricia and Jennifer's daughters, both Monroe cousins, we'd still share genetic similarities. We'd be first cousins biologically. That would explain the resemblance without needing Elizabeth's genetics at all. Patricia was crying again, but quietly now. She asked me about Claire, what she was like, where she was. I told her Claire lived across town, that she was a teacher, like Mom had been, that she was married, no kids yet, that we'd just spent the day together yesterday cleaning out the attic. Patricia asked if Claire knew any of this. I said no. No one knew except us, not even Claire herself. We sat in the stifling attic, surrounded by my mother's secrets. I didn't know what to do with this information. If it was even really information, or just speculation built on coincidence and fear? We had 2 bracelets, a sympathy card, and a lot of questions. We didn't have proof. We didn't know for certain what Elizabeth had done or why. All we had was a theory that made my stomach turn. Patricia said she needed to find Jennifer. She needed to know what had really happened that day at the hospital, whether her cousin's baby had really died or if something else had occurred. I agreed, though part of me wanted to leave this alone, to pack up the shoebox and pretend I'd never found that bracelet. But I couldn't, not when Claire might be involved, not when my entire identity was at stake. I asked Patricia if she knew how to find Jennifer. She shook her head, but said she'd start with the family, people who might have stayed in touch. It had been 31 years, but maybe someone knew where Jennifer had ended up. I said I'd look through more of Mom's things, see if there were other clues. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet again in a few days. As Patricia left, she looked back at me with such sadness. I realized she was seeing the daughter she'd given up, maybe for the first time, really seeing me. After Patricia left, I sat alone in the attic for a long time. The sun was setting, orange light slanting through the small window. I held both bracelets in my hands, trying to understand how my mother, the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me right from wrong, who'd been unfailingly honest in all the ways I could remember, could have done something so monstrous. If the theory was right, she'd stolen a baby, maybe 2 babies. She'd let people believe a child was dead when she wasn't. But I couldn't reconcile that with the mother I'd known. Mom had been kind, patient, loving. She'd been there for every scraped knee, every bad grade, every heartbreak. She'd loved me completely, or at least I'd always believed she had. Could someone who did something so terrible also be a good mother? Could both things be true at once? The cognitive dissonance made my head ache. I heard a car in the driveway and looked out the small window. Claire was home, getting out of her car with grocery bags. My heart clenched. I had to talk to her, but I didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone that everything they know about themselves might be a lie? That their mother might have stolen them? That their entire existence was built on a crime? I came down from the attic and found Claire in the kitchen putting away groceries. She smiled when she saw me, asked if I'd been here all day. I must have looked terrible because her smile faded quickly. She asked if I was okay, and I realized I was still holding one of the bracelets. I'd put Patricia's in my pocket, but kept the other one in my hand, like I couldn't let it go. Claire saw the bracelet and recognized it from the day before. She asked why I was still obsessing over that thing, said it wasn't healthy to fixate on random objects when we should be grieving. Her words were gentle, concerned, but they made something inside me snap. I told her it wasn't random. I told her the name on the bracelet was Monroe, not Hartley. I told her I'd found the woman who owned it, and she'd told me things that changed everything. Claire's expression shifted from concern to confusion to something like fear. She asked what I was talking about, what woman. I said we needed to sit down. She put down the can of soup she'd been holding and followed me to the living room. We sat on the couch where we'd sat hundreds of times as kids, watching movies and fighting over the remote. Now we were about to have a conversation that would shatter both our worlds. I told her everything. About Patricia, about the adoption, about Mom not being my biological mother. Claire listened in silence, her face getting paler with every word. When I finished, she shook her head slowly. She said I must have misunderstood something, that this woman was probably confused or lying. Mom would never have done something like that. She would never have lied about something so fundamental. It was impossible. But I kept going. I told her about the 2 bracelets, about Jennifer Monroe, about the baby who supposedly died. I showed her Claire's own birth certificate on my phone, pointed out the date. May 1992, not May 1995. She stared at it, and I watched understanding dawn on her face. She'd seen her birth certificate before, obviously, but she'd never questioned it. Why would she? Now she was seeing it with new eyes, realizing the impossibility. Claire started breathing faster, shaking her head more vigorously. She said there had to be an explanation. A clerical error, maybe. Someone had written the wrong year. It happened all the time. She pulled out her own phone and searched for her birth records, her social security information, anything that would confirm what she'd always believed about herself. But everything said 1992. There was no error. She'd been lied to for her entire life. Claire looked at me like I was a stranger. She asked if I really believed this, if I really thought Mom had stolen us. Her voice broke on the word us. She'd understood the implication. If I'd been taken from Patricia and my birth year was 1992 and Claire's birth year was also 1992, then Claire hadn't been born 3 years later like we'd always thought. She'd been born 1 month after me, which meant she couldn't be Mom's biological daughter either. I said I didn't know what to believe yet. We needed more information. I told her about Patricia trying to find Jennifer. Claire stood up abruptly, pacing the living room. She said this was insane, that we were letting grief make us paranoid. But her voice lacked conviction. She'd seen the evidence. She'd seen her own birth certificate with its impossible date. She couldn't explain it away, and neither could I. We stood in uncomfortable silence. I wanted to hug her, to comfort her the way sisters should. But there was a new distance between us, a question mark where certainty used to be. Were we even sisters? If we'd both been taken from different mothers, we weren't related at all. We'd just been two stolen babies raised in the same house. The thought made me feel hollow inside. Over the next few days, Patricia called me regularly with updates. She'd found a second cousin who thought Jennifer had moved to Oregon years ago. Another relative remembered hearing she'd become a drug addict after the baby died, that the grief had destroyed her. No one had seen her in decades. No one was even sure if she was still alive. The trail was cold, and I could hear Patricia's frustration and despair over the phone. Claire and I searched Mom's house more thoroughly. We went through every box in the attic, every drawer in her bedroom, every file in her home office. We found more pieces of the puzzle. Hospital bills from 1992, but the names had been blacked out. Old journals, but with pages torn out. A safe deposit box key that led to a bank account we didn't know about. Everything we found raised more questions without providing answers. We discovered that Mom had taken a 6-month leave of absence from her teaching job in early 1992. She'd told the school district she was pregnant and needed bed rest. But according to Patricia, Mom had known she couldn't get pregnant. Why would she tell such an elaborate lie unless she was planning something? Unless she'd already made arrangements to take Patricia's baby and was setting up the story in advance? The safe deposit box contained more documents, all carefully preserved. There were falsified medical records showing Elizabeth Hartley's pregnancy in 1992, records of a birth at home with a midwife who didn't exist when we tried to track her down. And most damning, there were 2 sets of adoption papers, one for me, using Patricia's real signature, one for Claire, using a signature I didn't recognize. Jennifer's? We couldn't know without finding her. But there was also a letter. It was addressed to no one, undated, in Mom's handwriting. Claire and I sat in the bank's private room and read it together. It started with an explanation, almost a confession. Mom wrote about her desperation for a child, about the pain of infertility, about feeling like less of a woman because her body wouldn't do what bodies were supposed to do. Her words were raw, honest, heartbreaking. Then the tone shifted. She wrote about meeting Patricia, about seeing an opportunity, about another mother in the hospital, even younger, even more helpless, about a baby the doctors said wouldn't make it through the night, about making decisions that she knew were wrong, but that felt necessary at the time, about loving us more than anything in the world, which she said should count for something, even if it didn't excuse what she'd done. The letter went on for pages. Mom explained how she'd manipulated the hospital records, how she'd used her position as a nurse to access files and make changes, how she'd convinced Jennifer that her baby had died when the infant was actually in the NICU, fighting for life, how she'd taken that baby, Claire, home just a few days after taking me, how she'd created false documents and bribed the right people and constructed an entire elaborate lie. She wrote about Dad, about how guilty she'd felt keeping the truth from him, but she'd been afraid he'd make her return us if he knew. So she lied to him too, let him believe we were both his biological daughters. When Claire was born, she'd told him she'd been wrong about her due date, that the baby came early. He'd been so happy, so besotted with his new daughter, that he'd never questioned it. The letter ended with an apology that felt both sincere and inadequate. Mom wrote that she'd always known this might come out someday, after she was gone. She said she'd kept this letter as insurance, as a way to explain from beyond the grave. She said she was sorry for the pain this would cause, but she wasn't sorry for taking us. We'd given her a life worth living, and she'd given us a good home. She hoped that would be enough. She hoped we could forgive her someday. Claire threw the letter across the room. She was crying, but her tears were angry, not sad. She said Mom had stolen her entire life, and then had the audacity to ask for forgiveness. She said she didn't care about Mom's desperation or pain. Lots of people couldn't have children. They didn't kidnap babies. They didn't destroy other people's lives to make themselves feel whole. Claire's rage filled the small room, and I couldn't blame her. I felt differently, or maybe I just felt everything at once: betrayal, anger, grief, confusion, but also understanding in a twisted way. I'd seen how much Mom had loved us. I'd felt it every day of my childhood. That love had been real, even if its foundation was built on terrible crimes. I didn't know if that made it better or worse. I didn't know how to reconcile the mother I'd known with the woman who'd written this letter. Claire wanted to go to the police immediately. She wanted Mom's reputation destroyed, wanted everyone to know what she'd done. I understood the impulse, but I hesitated. Mom was dead. Prosecuting her was impossible. And going public would mean exposing ourselves, admitting that our entire lives had been lies. We'd become the stolen babies in news headlines. I didn't know if I could handle that kind of scrutiny, and neither did she, really, underneath the rage. We decided to wait, not forever, but until we found Jennifer, until we could give Claire at least one real answer about where she came from. Patricia was still searching, following every lead, no matter how cold. Claire threw herself into the search too, spending hours online, looking through public records and social media. I watched her obsession grow and worried, but I didn't try to stop her. She needed this. Meanwhile, we kept sorting through Mom's house, though it felt different now. Every object was tainted by the knowledge of what she'd done. Claire wanted to sell everything, get rid of it all, and never look back. I found myself defending certain items: the kitchen table where we'd eaten dinner as a family, the photo albums full of birthday parties and vacations. Claire accused me of defending Mom, and maybe I was. I didn't know anymore. Our relationship grew strained. We'd always been close, but now there was this wedge between us. She was angry that I wasn't as angry as she was. I was frustrated that she couldn't see the complexity of the situation. We were both grieving, but in completely different ways. The sister I'd known my whole life felt like a stranger now, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap. 3 weeks after our first meeting, Patricia called with news. She'd found someone who'd been in touch with Jennifer recently, a former social worker who'd helped her get into rehab 10 years ago. Jennifer was clean now, living in a small town in Oregon, working at a grocery store. She'd changed her last name, which was why she'd been so hard to track down. The social worker had been reluctant to give out information, but Patricia had been persistent. She had an address. Claire wanted to go immediately. She booked plane tickets for that weekend without even asking if I was coming. I booked my own ticket separately. We flew to Oregon in silence, Patricia sitting between us like a buffer. The flight was only a few hours, but it felt endless. I kept thinking about what we'd say to Jennifer, how she'd react to finding out her daughter hadn't died after all. It seemed cruel, in a way, to give someone back something they'd mourned for 3 decades. We rented a car and drove to the address in silence. The town was small, surrounded by mountains, beautiful in a way that felt wrong for what we were about to do. We pulled up in front of a modest apartment building. Patricia looked terrified. Claire looked determined. I felt numb. We sat in the car for 10 minutes before anyone moved. Patricia knocked. We heard footsteps, and then the door opened. The woman who answered was thin, with graying blonde hair and tired eyes. She looked at Patricia without recognition at first, then her eyes widened. She said Patricia's name like a question. Patricia nodded and asked if they could talk. Jennifer looked at Claire and me, confused, but she stepped aside and let us in. Her apartment was small but clean, decorated with plants and thrift store furniture. We sat awkwardly in her living room while Jennifer made tea with shaking hands. She kept glancing at us, and I could see her trying to figure out why we were there. When she finally sat down, Patricia didn't waste time. She said she needed to ask about Jennifer's baby, the one born in 1992. Jennifer's face closed off immediately. She said her daughter was dead. She'd been born too early, too sick. She died a few hours after birth. It had been 31 years ago, and she'd made her peace with it. She'd gone to therapy, worked through her grief, rebuilt her life. She asked us to leave. But Patricia pressed on. She asked if Jennifer was sure the baby had died, if she'd seen the body, held her daughter. Jennifer's expression changed then, shifted to uncertainty. Jennifer said she'd been so young, barely 17. She'd been alone at the hospital, terrified. The nurses had told her the baby was sick, that they were doing everything they could. One nurse in particular, a woman named Elizabeth, had been very kind. Elizabeth had held her hand, brought her food, stayed with her when no one else would. When the baby died, Elizabeth had said it was better this way, that Jennifer was too young to be a mother anyway. Jennifer hadn't seen the baby's body. Elizabeth had said it was better not to, that she should remember the baby as she'd been in the womb, not as she was after death. Jennifer had been too devastated, too overwhelmed to question it. She'd signed the papers Elizabeth brought her. She'd left the hospital empty-handed and had spent the next decade trying to destroy herself because she couldn't handle the grief. Patricia told her the truth, that her baby might not have died, that Elizabeth might have taken her. Jennifer's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, horror, and finally a desperate, fragile hope. She looked at Claire and asked if Patricia was saying what she thought she was saying. Claire nodded and said she might be Jennifer's daughter. The room went very quiet. Jennifer started crying, but she also started shaking her head. She said she couldn't believe it, couldn't let herself hope after all this time. She needed proof. We'd anticipated this. Claire had brought her birth certificate, the hospital bracelet, Mom's letter. She spread them all out on Jennifer's coffee table. Jennifer picked up the bracelet with trembling hands, brought it close to her face to read the name. Baby Girl Monroe, her maiden name. She said she'd named her daughter Lily, just in her head, never officially, because the baby had died before she could be registered. But in the hospital, for those few hours when Jennifer had believed her daughter would live, she'd called her Lily. She'd whispered it to her through the NICU window. She asked Claire if she'd ever gone by Lily, even as a nickname. Claire shook her head. She'd always been Claire, from birth, or from whatever her birth had been. We explained about the DNA test we wanted to do. Jennifer agreed immediately. We found a clinic nearby that could do a rush test, and we all went together. The process was quick, just a cheek swab, but the results would take a few days. We exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. As we left, Jennifer grabbed Claire's hand and held it for a long moment. She said she'd prayed every day for 31 years that her baby was in heaven. She'd never thought to pray that she might be alive. We stayed in Oregon for 3 days, waiting for the results. Patricia got a hotel room, but Claire and I got separate ones. We barely spoke to each other. The distance between us had grown into a chasm. I tried to reach out a few times, suggested we get dinner or talk about what we'd learned. She always had an excuse. I realized she blamed me, somehow, for not being as angry as she was. Or maybe she just needed someone to blame, and I was there. I spent a lot of time with Patricia. We talked about everything. Her life after giving me up, her regrets, her relief that I'd turned out okay. She asked about my childhood, and I told her about school plays and family vacations and normal, happy things. She cried and said she was glad I'd had a good life, even if it had started with a lie. I asked if she regretted giving me up, and she said yes and no. She wouldn't have been a good mother at 19, but she wished she'd had the choice. On the third day, the clinic called. The results were ready. We drove there together, all 4 of us: Patricia, Jennifer, Claire, and me. The tension in the car was suffocating. When we sat down with the geneticist, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear. The doctor looked at Claire and Jennifer and said what we'd all been preparing for. They were mother and daughter. 99.9% certainty. Jennifer broke down completely. She kept saying she couldn't believe it. After all these years, her daughter was alive. Claire sat frozen, not crying, not speaking, just staring at the paper with the test results. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. She stood up and walked out of the room. I followed her to the parking lot, where she was standing by the car, arms wrapped around herself. She said she didn't know how to feel. She'd wanted the truth, and now she had it, but it didn't make anything better. Elizabeth Hartley had stolen her. She'd spent 31 years with the wrong mother, believing lies, living a life that was never supposed to be hers. Her real mother was a stranger, a recovering addict who worked at a grocery store. She'd lost 3 decades they could have had together. Nothing could give that back. I said, at least she knew now. At least she could build a relationship with Jennifer going forward. But Claire said it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She'd been robbed of her real family, her real identity, her real life. And the woman who'd done it was dead, beyond reach, beyond punishment. There was no justice possible, no way to make things right. We stood in the parking lot in silence, and I felt our sisterhood crumbling to dust. We flew back home the next day. Jennifer wanted Claire to stay, to spend time together, to start building something. But Claire said she needed time to process everything. She promised to stay in touch, to call, to visit. I didn't know if she meant it or if she was just being polite. Jennifer looked heartbroken, but understanding. Patricia looked sad for everyone involved. I just felt tired. Bone deep tired. Claire and I still had to decide what to do with the information we had. Go to the police, go to the press, or keep it private. Claire wanted to expose everything, wanted the world to know what Elizabeth Hartley had done. She said other stolen children deserved to know the truth, that there might be more victims. I couldn't argue with that logic, but I also couldn't bear the thought of our story becoming public property. We fought about it for weeks. She accused me of protecting Mom's memory, of caring more about a dead kidnapper than about justice. I accused her of being more interested in revenge than in healing. We said terrible things to each other, things sisters shouldn't say. Eventually, we compromised. We'd tell the authorities privately, let them investigate, but we'd request that our identities be kept confidential if possible. It wasn't what either of us wanted, but it was something. The police opened an investigation into Elizabeth Hartley's actions. They found more evidence, manipulated hospital records, falsified documents, even a small payment to a hospital administrator who'd helped her cover her tracks. The administrator was in his 70s now, suffering from dementia, unable to face charges. Mom's former colleagues were shocked. They said she'd been such a kind person, so dedicated to her patients. No one had suspected anything. The hospital issued a formal apology to Patricia and Jennifer. They implemented new security measures to prevent anything like this from happening again. It felt hollow, pointless. What good were new policies when the damage was already done? Patricia accepted their apology with grace. Jennifer didn't respond at all. She'd moved on with her life once already. She didn't want to be pulled back into the past. The investigation determined that Mom had acted alone, that Dad had truly known nothing. That was some comfort, at least. I could still believe in my father, still hold on to the memories of him without them being tainted by lies. Claire didn't share my relief. She said Dad should have known, should have suspected something. She couldn't forgive him for his willful ignorance, even though he'd been an innocent victim too. Patricia asked if she could see me regularly, maybe start building a relationship. Not as mother and daughter, she knew that ship had sailed, but as something. Friends, maybe. Relatives who'd been separated and were now reunited. I wanted to say yes. Part of me was curious about her, about what our relationship could have been if things had been different. But I also felt disloyal to Mom, which was absurd considering what Mom had done. We started meeting for coffee once a week. Patricia told me about her life. She'd eventually gone to college, become a teacher like Mom had been. She'd never married, never had other children. She said she'd never felt like she deserved happiness after giving me up. I told her that was wrong, that she'd made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. She said she wished she believed that. We were both damaged by Mom's actions in different ways. Patricia also reached out to Claire, but Claire wasn't interested. She said she already had one biological mother she was trying to figure out how to have a relationship with. She couldn't handle another one. Patricia understood, but looked hurt. I felt caught in the middle, trying to maintain relationships with everyone, trying to keep peace. It was exhausting, and I was starting to resent all of them for putting me in this position. 2 months after the DNA results, Claire flew back to Oregon to spend time with Jennifer. She didn't invite me, which stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd been with her through everything, and now she was shutting me out. Patricia reminded me that Claire needed to do this alone, that it wasn't about me. But it felt like it was about me. about us, about the fact that we weren't really sisters anymore. Claire stayed in Oregon for a week. She called me once during that time, briefly, to say she was fine. She didn't offer details. When she came back, she seemed different, quieter, more settled in some way. I asked how it went, and she said it was complicated. Jennifer was nice, but they were strangers. They didn't have shared memories or inside jokes or any of the things that made a mother-daughter relationship real. They were trying to build something from nothing, and it was hard. But Claire also said she was glad she'd gone. She and Jennifer had talked about everything. The day Claire was born, what Jennifer had been told, the years Jennifer had spent grieving. Jennifer had shown Claire baby pictures of herself, and Claire said it was surreal seeing where she'd gotten her features from. The blonde hair was from Jennifer. The nose was from Jennifer's father, who died when Jennifer was young. Claire was assembling her real history piece by piece. I asked Claire if we were still sisters. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. She said we were raised as sisters, we'd grown up together, we'd shared a home and parents and a childhood that didn't just disappear because we weren't genetically related. But it was different now. The easy closeness we'd had was gone, replaced by something more complicated. We were connected by trauma and secrets, not by blood or choice. I said I missed her, missed us the way we used to be. She said she missed it too, but we couldn't go back. Too much had changed. We knew too much. Every memory was tainted now by the knowledge of what Mom had done, by the lie we'd lived our whole lives. She couldn't look at childhood photos without feeling angry. She couldn't think about family vacations without wondering about the life she should have had with Jennifer. We agreed to keep trying, to stay in each other's lives, but we both knew it would never be the same. We'd been broken by the truth, and some things can't be fixed. We were like a vase that had shattered and been glued back together, still functional, still recognizable, but fundamentally changed. The cracks would always be visible. We put Mom's house on the market. Neither of us wanted it. Claire said she couldn't stand to be in there, surrounded by reminders of the lie. I felt differently. I still had happy memories in that house, still felt Mom's love in every room. But I didn't fight her. We hired an estate sale company to deal with most of the belongings. I kept a few things, some photo albums, Mom's jewelry, Dad's watch. Claire kept almost nothing. The house sold quickly. A young family bought it, excited about the neighborhood and the good school district. I wondered if they could feel the secrets in the walls, the weight of what had happened there. Probably not. To them, it was just a house, a blank slate for their own memories. I envied them that innocence. I wished I could see the house that way again, as just a building, not a crime scene. We split the money from the sale. Claire used her half as a down payment on a new house across town, as far from the old neighborhood as she could get. I put mine in savings, unable to decide what to do with it. It felt like blood money, profit from a life built on kidnapping. Patricia said I should use it for something good, something that would honor the complicated truth of my history. I still hadn't figured out what that would be. The holidays were approaching, and I dreaded them. Our first Thanksgiving without Mom. Our first Christmas. Before all of this, Claire and I would have spent them together, supporting each other through the grief. Now, I didn't know if she'd even want to see me. When I called to ask, she was non-committal. She said she might spend Thanksgiving with Jennifer in Oregon. She'd let me know. The uncertainty hurt worse than an outright rejection. Patricia invited me to spend Thanksgiving with her and some of her friends. It was kind of her, but the thought of sitting at a stranger's table felt wrong. I ended up spending the day alone, ordering Chinese food and watching movies. I told myself I was fine, but I wasn't. I kept thinking about past Thanksgivings, Mom's famous stuffing, Dad carving the turkey, Claire and I fighting over who got more mashed potatoes. All those memories felt like lies now. Claire did go to Oregon for Thanksgiving. She posted a photo on social media, her and Jennifer together, smiling. I stared at that photo for a long time. Claire looked happy, or at least content. I was glad for her, truly, but I also felt abandoned. She was building a new life, a real life, with her real mother, and I was stuck in the wreckage of our shared past. Patricia had given me up willingly. I didn't have the comfort of a mother who'd wanted to keep me. I found myself getting angry at Patricia. It wasn't fair or rational, but emotions rarely are. She'd chosen to give me up. Yes, she'd been young and scared and alone, but she'd still made a choice. Elizabeth had taken that choice and turned it into something monstrous. But Patricia had started the chain of events. If she'd kept me, if she'd found a way to make it work, none of this would have happened. I'd have grown up with my real mother, known my real identity from the start. I stopped meeting Patricia for coffee. When she called, I let it go to voicemail. She left concerned messages asking if I was okay, saying she was worried about me. I didn't return them. I knew I was being unfair, but I couldn't help it. I was drowning in grief and anger and confusion, and I needed someone to blame. Elizabeth was dead. Jennifer had been a victim too. That left Patricia, who'd started this whole mess by getting pregnant and giving away her baby. Eventually, Patricia showed up at my apartment. She looked worried, older than I'd seen her before. She asked to come in, and I couldn't find a reason to refuse her. We sat in my living room, tension thick between us. She asked what she'd done wrong. I told her the truth, that I was angry at her for giving me up, for setting all of this in motion. Her face crumpled, and she started crying. She said she'd been punishing herself for 31 years. Never forgiven herself, never let herself be happy, never allowed herself to move on completely. She'd thought that meeting me, seeing that I'd turned out okay, would finally give her peace. Instead, it had just opened old wounds. She said she was sorry, so sorry, but she'd been a child herself when she got pregnant. 19 years old, alone, terrified. She'd made the best choice she could with the information she had. I knew she was right. Logically, I knew none of this was her fault. She'd been a victim of Elizabeth's manipulation, just like Jennifer, just like me. But emotions aren't logical. I needed someone to be angry at, and she was there. She was alive and reachable, unlike Elizabeth. She accepted my anger without defending herself further. She said she understood, that I had every right to feel however I felt. That just made me feel worse, guilty for blaming her. We sat in silence for a while. Then I asked her what she would have done differently if she could go back. She said she'd have kept me, found a way to make it work, even though it would have been almost impossible. She said she'd spent 3 decades wondering about me, imagining what I looked like, what kind of person I'd become. Meeting me had been a gift, even with all the pain. Then she asked if I was sorry I'd found the bracelet, sorry I knew the truth. I couldn't answer her. Was I sorry I knew? I'd asked myself that question 100 times. My life before finding the bracelet had been simpler. I'd had a mother, a sister, an identity I was certain of. Now I had confusion and anger and relationships I didn't know how to navigate. If I could go back and not find that bracelet, not search through that shoebox, Would I? The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. The truth had cost me so much, but living a lie would have cost me too, in ways I'd never have recognized. I told Patricia I didn't know if I was sorry or not. The truth had shattered my world, but at least now I was living in reality. Mom had loved me. I believed that, but she'd also built my entire existence on a foundation of crime and deception. Every happy memory was tainted by that knowledge. Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every moment of maternal affection. All of it wrapped up in the fact that she'd stolen me from my real mother. Patricia said that was the hardest part, reconciling the good with the terrible. Elizabeth had done something unforgivable, but she'd also raised 2 daughters with love. She'd been a good mother in every way except the most fundamental one. Patricia said she was grateful for that, at least. If Elizabeth had taken me and been cruel, if I'd suffered, Patricia would never have forgiven herself. Knowing I'd been loved was the only comfort she had in this nightmare. I apologized to Patricia for shutting her out. She apologized for existing in a way that made things complicated. We laughed a little at that, a bitter sound. We agreed to keep meeting for coffee, but maybe less frequently. We both needed space to process everything. She was a reminder of my stolen past, and I was a reminder of her greatest regret. Being together was hard, but not being in contact at all was harder. We were connected, whether we wanted to be or not. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone again. Claire was still in Oregon, extending her stay to spend more time with Jennifer. She called me on Christmas morning, briefly, to say Merry Christmas. The conversation was awkward, full of long pauses. We didn't know how to talk to each other anymore. We didn't know what we were to each other. Sisters, ex-sisters, cousins, strangers who'd shared a childhood. All of those and none of them. After we hung up, I looked at the photo albums I'd saved from Mom's house. Pictures of Claire and me as babies, toddlers, kids. In every photo, Mom looked happy, proud, loving. I tried to see the kidnapper behind those smiling eyes and couldn't. I tried to reconcile the mother I'd known with the woman who'd written that confession letter and couldn't do that either. She was both people somehow. Good and evil in one person. That was the hardest truth of all. Winter turned to spring. I started seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in identity issues and family trauma. It helped, slowly. I learned that grief is complicated when the person you're grieving also hurt you. I learned that it's possible to love someone and hate what they did, to miss them and be angry at them simultaneously. I learned that family is both simpler and more complicated than I'd ever imagined. Blood doesn't determine who matters, but lies can destroy even the strongest bonds. Claire came back from Oregon after 3 months. She'd taken a leave of absence from her teaching job to spend time with Jennifer. She said they were building something real, slowly. It would never be a normal mother-daughter relationship, but it was theirs. She seemed more at peace, or at least less actively angry. She'd gotten the tattoo on her wrist, a small lily, Jennifer's name for her. I saw it when we met for coffee, the first time in months. We were different with each other now, more careful, more distant, but we were trying. We met once a month, updated each other on our lives. She told me about Jennifer, about Oregon, about the family members she'd met there. I told her about therapy, about Patricia, about trying to rebuild my sense of self. We didn't talk about Mom much. That wound was still too fresh, too painful. Maybe one day we'd be able to remember her together without it hurting so much. But not yet. Jennifer surprised everyone by forgiving Elizabeth. Claire told me about it, confused and a little angry. Jennifer had said that holding on to anger was destroying her, that she'd already lost 31 years with her daughter. She didn't want to lose any more time to bitterness. Elizabeth was dead. Jennifer couldn't confront her, couldn't get an apology, couldn't get justice. All she could do was forgive and move forward. Claire didn't understand it. Neither did I, really. But I admired it. Patricia struggled with forgiveness too. She said she'd never blamed Elizabeth before, had actually been grateful to her for giving me a good life. But now, knowing about Jennifer and Claire, knowing the full extent of Elizabeth's deception, she felt differently. Elizabeth had taken her choice, but at least had done it with her permission, twisted as that was. What she'd done to Jennifer was pure kidnapping. There was no gray area there, no mitigating circumstances. It was simply evil. I still didn't know how I felt about Mom. I missed her. I was angry at her. I loved her. I hated what she'd done. All of those things were true at the same time, and I was learning to live with the contradiction. My therapist said that was okay, that I didn't have to resolve it into one simple feeling. People are complicated. Situations are complicated. Life is rarely as simple as good versus evil. My therapist suggested I write a letter to Mom, say all the things I'd never get to say to her face. I resisted at first. It seemed pointless, therapeutic nonsense. But eventually I tried it. I sat down one night and just started writing. Everything poured out. My anger, my grief, my confusion, my love. I wrote about how her actions had destroyed my sense of identity, torn apart my relationship with Claire, created this impossible situation where I was grieving someone who'd committed terrible crimes. But I also wrote about the good memories. I wrote about how she'd stayed up with me when I was sick, how she'd taught me to read, how she'd been at every school play and soccer game. I wrote about her patience and kindness, her sense of humor, the way she made the world feel safe. I wrote that I believed she'd loved me, truly loved me, even though that love was built on a foundation of wrongdoing. I didn't know how to reconcile those two things, but they were both real. I ended the letter by saying I wished she'd given me the truth, no matter how painful. I wished she'd had the courage to tell me before she died, to face the consequences of her actions. Taking the secret to her grave was cowardly, even if I understood why she'd done it. She'd wanted to protect herself, protect me, protect the life we'd built together. But in protecting those things, she'd destroyed the possibility of honest relationship. I said I'd forgive her someday, maybe, but not yet. A year after finding the bracelet, I was still piecing together who I was. I'd had DNA tests done, learned about my genetic heritage. I'd met some of Patricia's extended family. Awkward encounters with cousins and aunts who didn't know what to make of me. I'd learned about my medical history, my genetic predispositions, all the practical things that knowing your biological family provides. But I still didn't know who I was. Fundamentally. Was I Patricia's daughter? Elizabeth's daughter? Neither? Both? My therapist said I gotta decide. That identity wasn't just about biology or who raised you. It was about who you chose to be, what stories you chose to tell about yourself. That felt both empowering and overwhelming. I'd spent 31 years with one story, and now I had to construct a new one from fragments and lies and painful truths. I was the same person I'd always been, but also completely different. Nothing about me had changed, and everything had changed. I started thinking about my future differently. Before, I planned my life around expectations I didn't even realize I had. I'd become a teacher like Mom. I'd stayed in the same town where I grew up. I'd been unconsciously replicating the life she'd created for me. Now, I wondered what I'd choose if I could choose freely, without the weight of her influence. I didn't have answers yet, but I was starting to ask the questions. Claire made different choices. She quit her teaching job and moved to Oregon permanently. She said she needed a fresh start, somewhere without memories of Elizabeth. She got a job at Jennifer's grocery store while she figured out what she really wanted to do with her life. She'd always been a teacher because Mom had been a teacher. Now, she was discovering that maybe she wanted something else entirely. She was thinking about going back to school, maybe studying art or environmental science, things that had nothing to do with Elizabeth's influence. She seemed happier, or at least more settled. She and Jennifer were building a real relationship, going to therapy together, learning each other. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. That honesty, even with all its difficulty, was healing in a way our old life had never been. Claire said she felt like herself for the first time, whoever that self was. She was discovering it day by day, without the weight of lies pressing down on her. Our relationship improved as we both healed, but it never went back to what it was. We talked on the phone every few weeks, visited each other a couple times a year. We'd always be connected by our shared past, by the mother who'd raised us and the secrets that had defined our childhood. But we were separate people now, building separate lives. Maybe that's what we always should have been. Maybe the forced closeness of our childhood had been another part of Elizabeth's deception, pretending we were something we weren't. Patricia and I developed a relationship that worked for us. We weren't mother and daughter. That ship had sailed when I was a few hours old. But we were something. Friends with a complicated history. Family members who'd been separated and reunited. We met for coffee every few weeks, talked about books and politics and our lives. She told me stories about her pregnancy, what she'd imagined for me, how she'd thought about me over the years. I told her about my childhood, giving her the gift of knowing I'd been loved and cared for. She said knowing me had given her the closure she'd needed for 3 decades. She'd always wondered, always worried, always felt guilty. Now she knew I was okay, or at least that I would be eventually. She was thinking about retiring, maybe doing some volunteer work with young mothers in crisis. She wanted to help girls like she'd been, make sure they had more support and better options than she'd had. Turning her pain into something useful seemed to help her heal. I admired her resilience. She'd survived so much. An unplanned pregnancy, the grief of giving up a baby, 3 decades of guilt and wondering. And she'd come out the other side as a kind, thoughtful person. She could have been bitter or broken, but she'd chosen differently. I hoped I could do the same, could take this terrible situation and find a way to grow from it rather than being destroyed by it. I learned that mothers are complicated. They're not the saints or villains we make them out to be. They're human beings with their own pain and desperation and flaws. Elizabeth had done something unforgivable, but she'd also loved fiercely. Patricia had given me up, but she'd been trying to give me a better life. Jennifer had been robbed of motherhood, but she'd found the strength to forgive. None of them were simply good or bad. They were all just people, doing their best in impossible situations. I learned that being a mother is about more than biology. Elizabeth had raised me, taught me, shaped who I became. That mattered, even though she'd stolen the right to do it. Patricia had carried me, given me life, made the hardest choice she could make. That mattered too. Jennifer had grieved me for 31 years without knowing I was alive. That mattered as well. They were all my mother in different ways, and none of them were. The title was too simple for the reality. I learned that I would probably never have a simple answer to the question of who my mother was. And maybe that was okay. Maybe life was messier than we wanted it to be, full of contradictions and complications. Maybe the need for simple answers was itself the problem. I could hold multiple truths at once. Elizabeth hurt me, and she loved me. Patricia gave me up, and she thought of me. Jennifer lost me, and she found me. All of it was true. We never did figure out why there were 2 bracelets. The hospital had records of only one Baby Girl Monroe born that day, Jennifer's daughter, later taken home by Elizabeth as Claire. Patricia's baby, me, had been part of a private arrangement, so there was no hospital bracelet for me officially. But the bracelet I'd found in the attic, the one that started everything, remained a mystery. It wasn't from the hospital where Jennifer gave birth. The plastic was different, the format slightly off. It might have been from a different hospital, a different baby entirely. Or maybe it had been something Elizabeth created herself, a prop to make her story more believable. Maybe she'd made fake bracelets for both of us, physical evidence to support her lie that she'd given birth. We'd never know. Elizabeth had taken so many secrets to her grave. The bracelet was just one more mystery among many, one more piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. I'd learned to live with not knowing everything. I kept both bracelets. They sat in a small box in my dresser, next to the letter Elizabeth had written. Reminders of where I'd come from, the tangle of truth and lies that had created my life. Sometimes I took them out and looked at them, trying to make sense of it all. I never could. But looking at them helped somehow, made the past feel more real, less like a nightmare I'd imagined. We had to decide whether to tell Dad's family, his brothers and sister, his elderly mother. They deserved to know the truth, but we also knew it would devastate them. They'd loved Elizabeth, mourned her death, celebrated her life. Learning that she'd been a kidnapper would destroy their memories of her. It would also mean explaining that Claire and I weren't their biological grandchildren, nieces. The family they thought they had didn't exist. Was it kinder to let them keep their illusions? Claire and I disagreed. She wanted full disclosure, wanted everyone to know the truth, no matter how painful. I wanted to protect them, to let them keep their happy memories of Elizabeth and their uncomplicated relationships with us. We fought about it, our worst fight since everything had come out. Eventually, we compromised. We told Dad's siblings, but not his mother, who was in her 90s and in poor health. There was no point in devastating her in her final years. Dad's siblings took it hard. His sister stopped speaking to us for months, unable to reconcile the truth with her memories. His brothers were more accepting, but distant. They said they didn't blame us, but we represented something painful now. Family gatherings became awkward, tense. Eventually, I stopped going. Claire had already moved to Oregon, so it was easier for her to cut ties. Another relationship destroyed by Elizabeth's lies, another casualty of the truth. I wondered if there were others. If Elizabeth had taken 2 babies, might she have tried to take more? Or had there been a failed attempt, another mother who'd escaped her manipulation? The police investigation hadn't found evidence of other crimes, but absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. The thought haunted me. What if there were other stolen children out there, living lives built on lies, not knowing the truth? Claire became obsessed with this possibility. She started researching missing children from the early 90s, looking for patterns. She contacted advocacy groups, spoke to other adoptees who discovered their adoptions weren't legal. She was trying to find meaning in what had happened to us, trying to turn her pain into purpose. I admired it, but I also worried about her. She was sacrificing her own healing to chase shadows that might not exist. I chose differently. I couldn't save other hypothetical victims. I could barely save myself. I focused on my own life, my own healing, my own future. Maybe that was selfish, but I needed to be selfish to survive this. Claire and I had different ways of coping, different ways of moving forward. Neither was wrong, neither was right. They were just different, like we were different, like we'd always been, even when we'd thought we were the same. People asked if I'd forgiven Elizabeth. The question always made me uncomfortable. Forgiveness implied that what she'd done was somehow forgivable, that there was a path to absolution. I didn't know if kidnapping could be forgiven. I didn't know if I wanted to forgive her. Forgiveness felt like letting her off the hook, saying what she did was okay because she'd loved me. But it wasn't okay. It would never be okay. Love didn't excuse crime. But holding on to anger was exhausting. I'd watched it eat away at me for months, turning me bitter and hard. I'd seen what it did to Claire in those early days, how it consumed her. Jennifer's forgiveness had seemed impossible to me at first, but now I wondered if she'd been wise. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about excusing the crime. Maybe it was about refusing to let the crime continue poisoning your life. Maybe it was choosing your own peace over someone else's punishment. I wasn't there yet. I didn't know if I'd ever be there, but I was working toward it, slowly. I was working toward a place where I could acknowledge what Elizabeth had done, hold her accountable in my heart, and still remember the good parts without feeling like a traitor. I was working toward a place where I could be both her daughter and her victim, where both truths could exist without destroying me. It was hard work, the hardest I'd ever done. 2 years after finding the bracelet, I made some big changes. I went back to school, started studying psychology with a focus on family systems and trauma. I wanted to understand what had happened to us, not just emotionally, but academically. I wanted to help other people who'd had their identities shattered. I wanted to turn my pain into purpose, like Claire was doing in her own way. It felt right. Felt like I was finally choosing my own path instead of following someone else's plan. I also started dating again, something I'd avoided since everything fell apart. I'd been afraid to let anyone get close, afraid they'd ask about my family and I'd have to explain the nightmare. But I met someone who listened to my story without judgment, who understood that family was complicated and identity was fluid. He had his own trauma, his own complicated relationship with his past. We understood each other in a way that felt rare and precious. Patricia was thrilled. She said she'd always worried I'd be alone, that the trauma of discovering the truth would make me unable to trust or love. Seeing me build a new life, find new connections, gave her hope. She said it was the best gift I could give her. Proof that I'd survived this, that Elizabeth's crimes hadn't destroyed me permanently. I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. Surviving, thriving even, was a kind of victory. Claire and Jennifer's relationship deepened over time. Claire told me they had real mother-daughter moments now. Inside jokes, shopping trips, long conversations about everything and nothing. They'd never get back the 31 years they'd lost, but they were making the most of what they had. Jennifer had grandparent fantasies, talking about Claire's future children with a wistfulness that made Claire uncomfortable. But mostly, they were just trying to be present, to appreciate what they'd found in each other. Jennifer had also started advocacy work, speaking out about coerced adoptions and the need for better safeguards. She shared her story publicly, which Claire both admired and resented. Claire wasn't ready to be public about what had happened. She wanted privacy, wanted to heal without the world watching. But Jennifer said, if their story could prevent even one other family from being destroyed like theirs had been, it was worth the exposure. They were still navigating what it meant to be family. Claire invited me to visit them in Oregon. I went, nervous about how it would feel to see them together. But it was actually okay. Seeing Claire happy, seeing her build something real with Jennifer, made me feel less guilty about my own complicated feelings. We weren't the same, Claire and I, weren't suffering in the same ways. That was okay. We could have different relationships with our biological mothers, different ways of healing, and still care about each other. We were learning that love was more flexible than we'd thought. 3 years after Elizabeth's death, Claire and I decided to create a new memorial for her. The original headstone just said, "Loving mother and wife," the standard platitudes. It felt like a lie now, but it also felt wrong to leave it as the only record. We commissioned a second, smaller stone to place nearby. It said, Elizabeth Hartley, complicated, flawed, human. We added the dates and nothing else. It felt more honest. People who visited could interpret it however they wanted. Patricia and Jennifer came to the cemetery when we placed it. It was strange, all 4 of us standing there, 2 stolen daughters, 2 mothers who'd been victimized. We didn't say much. What was there to say? Elizabeth had brought us all together, connected us in ways none of us would have chosen. She'd hurt all of us. She'd loved some of us. She'd been deeply, tragically flawed. The new stone acknowledged that complexity without excusing it. It felt right. Afterward, we went to dinner together. The 4 of us sitting around a table, sharing a meal, felt surreal. We talked about normal things, work, hobbies, the weather. We avoided the heavy topics that connected us. It was nice in a strange way. Maybe this was the future. Not constant processing of trauma, but occasional gatherings where we acknowledged our shared past without being consumed by it. Maybe we could be something like a family, not the one we'd expected, but a family nonetheless. When I finally finished my degree and started working as a therapist, I specialized in identity issues and family trauma. My clients didn't always know my personal story, but sometimes I shared it when it seemed relevant. I told them about finding the bracelet, about discovering my entire life was built on lies, about the long, painful process of rebuilding. I told them that identity was both more fragile and more resilient than we thought, that you could lose everything you thought was true about yourself and still survive. Still be yourself, whoever that self turned out to be. I told them that family was complicated, that the people who raised you mattered, and so did the people who gave birth to you, and so did the people you chose. That love could coexist with terrible actions, that you could grieve someone and be angry at them simultaneously, that forgiveness was optional and healing was possible either way. that there were no simple answers, just the messy, complicated truth of being human and connected to other humans. My clients found these messages helpful, or at least that's what they told me. Maybe I was drawn to this work because I was still working through my own issues. Maybe I'd never fully heal from what Elizabeth had done. But helping others navigate similar trauma gave meaning to my pain. It made the nightmare feel less pointless. If my suffering could ease someone else's suffering, then maybe it had been worth it. Not worth what Elizabeth did. That could never be justified. But worth what I'd learned, the person I'd become. On what would have been my 35th birthday, Patricia gave me a gift. It was a small jewelry box, old and battered. Inside was a locket, tarnished silver, with a tiny photo inside. Patricia as a young woman, barely recognizable, holding a newborn. Me. She said she'd worn it for a year after giving me up, then had put it away because looking at it hurt too much. She'd kept it all these years, waiting for a day when she could give it to me. If that day ever came. It had come. I was here, real, no longer just a photograph and a memory. I cried when I opened it. Patricia cried too. We sat in her living room, the same room where she'd first told me the truth 3 years earlier, and cried together. She said she'd spent 35 years imagining this moment, where she could give me something that proved I'd mattered to her. That even though she'd given me up, I'd never stopped being her daughter in her heart. I thanked her and said I'd treasure it. I meant it. The locket sits on my dresser now, next to the 2 bracelets. Reminders of where I came from, all the complicated paths that led to me being here, being me. Sometimes I open it and look at Patricia's young face, so full of sadness and hope. Sometimes I put it on and wear it under my clothes, a secret connection to the woman who gave me life. She'll never be my mother the way Elizabeth was, but she's something. She's important. She's part of my story. Claire got engaged to someone she'd met in Oregon, a good man who knew her whole story and loved her anyway. She called to tell me, excited and nervous. She wanted me to be in the wedding, she said. She knew things between us weren't what they used to be, but I was still her sister. She still wanted me there for the important moments. I said yes immediately. Whatever complicated feelings existed between us, I still loved her. I still wanted her to be happy. The wedding was small, just family and close friends. Jennifer was there, of course, beaming with pride and joy. Patricia came too, at my invitation. It felt right to have both our biological mothers there, witnessing Claire commit to building a family of her own. A family that would be honest from the start, that wouldn't be built on secrets. Claire's fiancé's family was warm and welcoming, uncomplicated in their love. I envied Claire that normalcy in her future, even as I was happy for her. During the reception, Claire pulled me aside. She said she'd been thinking about us, about how to define our relationship now. She'd decided that we were sisters in all the ways that mattered, not biologically, but in shared experience, shared history, shared trauma. We'd grown up together. We'd survived Elizabeth together. We'd rebuilt ourselves together. That made us family. I agreed, tears in my eyes. We'd lost the easy closeness of before, but we'd built something new, something harder won and maybe more real. There were questions we'd never have answers to. Why had Elizabeth done it? Just desperation? Or was there something darker? Had she ever felt guilty? Or had she rationalized it so completely she believed her own lies? When she looked at us, did she see her daughters or her crimes? Had keeping the secret eaten at her, or had she made peace with it? We'd never know. The letter she'd left explained the what, but not really the why. The psychology behind stealing babies was complex, beyond my ability to fully understand, even with all my training. I'd also never know who I would have been if Patricia had kept me. Would I have been happier? Sadder? Different in fundamental ways, or mostly the same? It was pointless to speculate, but I did it anyway. I imagined a parallel life where I grew up poor but wanted, where I knew the truth from the beginning, where my identity was simple and honest. Would that have been better? Maybe, but I'd never know. I could only live the life I had, shaped by Elizabeth's crime and her love in equal measure. And I'd never know if Elizabeth had regrets at the end, if, as she was dying, she thought about telling us the truth, if she considered confessing, unburdening herself before it was too late. She must have known we'd find out eventually. The letter proved that. But she'd chosen to let us discover it after her death, when we couldn't confront her, couldn't demand answers. That felt cowardly to me, even though I understood the impulse to avoid consequences. She'd protected herself even in death. I learned to live with not knowing everything. That was maybe the hardest lesson of all. I wanted complete understanding, wanted to know every detail of what Elizabeth had done and why. I wanted to trace every decision, understand every motivation. But life doesn't work that way. People are mysteries, even people we know intimately, especially people we know intimately. They can surprise us with their capacity for both love and cruelty, sometimes in the same moment. Elizabeth had surprised me in the worst way possible, but she'd also loved me in real ways. I had to believe that to keep from going crazy. She'd tucked me in at night, kissed my scraped knees, celebrated my achievements. Those moments had been real, even if their foundation was built on lies. Love and crime had coexisted in her. Maybe they coexisted in all of us, though hopefully not to such an extreme degree. Maybe we were all capable of terrible things under the right circumstances. That thought was both disturbing and oddly comforting. I stopped trying to fully understand Elizabeth. I accepted that she'd been deeply flawed, that she'd done something unforgivable, and that she'd loved me anyway. All of that was true. The contradictions didn't need to be resolved. I could hold them all in my mind simultaneously. That acceptance brought a kind of peace, not complete, but enough. Enough to keep living, keep building, keep moving forward into a future that was mine to choose. Home had always been a place. My childhood house, my parents, my sister. When all of that fell apart, I felt homeless in a profound way. Not literally. I had an apartment, a job, a life. But emotionally, spiritually, I had nowhere to belong. I'd lost my family identity, my sense of where I came from. I'd been untethered, floating in space with nothing to anchor me. The feeling had been terrifying. I'd spent years searching for a new home, a new anchor. Eventually, I realized I was looking in the wrong places. Home wasn't in the past I'd lost, or the biological connections I'd found. It wasn't in Patricia or Jennifer or even Claire. It was in myself, in the person I'd chosen to become despite everything, in my resilience, my capacity for growth, my ability to hold complexity. I was my own home, my own anchor. That realization changed everything. I stopped looking outward for validation and started building inward instead. It sounds like a platitude, something you'd read in a self-help book. But for me, it was revolutionary. I'd spent my whole life defining myself in relation to other people. Daughter, sister, student, friend. When those relationships became complicated or broken, I'd lost myself. Learning to be whole on my own, to not need external validation or a clear family history, was the hardest and most important work I'd ever done. I was still doing it. I'd probably always be doing it. But at least now I knew the direction to go. When people asked about my family now, I had to decide what story to tell. The simple version, my parents are dead, I have a sister who lives in Oregon, or the complicated truth. Most of the time, I chose the simple version. The truth was exhausting to explain, and most people didn't need to know. It was my story to share or not share as I chose. That felt empowering. I controlled the narrative now, not Elizabeth, not circumstances, not the weight of secrets. But sometimes I told the whole truth. With close friends, with romantic partners, with clients when it seemed relevant. I told them about the bracelet, the discovery, the unraveling of everything I'd believed. I told them how it had broken me and how I'd rebuilt myself. I told them because it was important, because it had shaped who I was, because hiding it felt like continuing Elizabeth's pattern of deception. The truth was mine now, and I could wield it as I chose. The story evolved as I told it. In the beginning, it was all anger and betrayal. Later, it became more nuanced, acknowledging the complexity. Eventually, it became a story of survival and growth. I'd been victimized, yes, but I wasn't just a victim. I was also a survivor, a therapist, a friend, a partner. The kidnapping was part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. I was writing new chapters every day, ones where I decided what came next. That was my revenge, my justice, my healing. The bracelet that started everything, the one I'd found in the attic that Thursday afternoon 4 years ago, sits in a frame on my office wall. Not the office at home, but my professional office where I see clients. Some of them notice it and ask what it is. I tell them it's a reminder that our identities are more fragile than we think, that we can survive having our entire world upended, that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. They seem to find that meaningful. So do I. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found it, if I'd just thrown away that shoebox without looking through it, or if the bracelet had been buried deeper where I wouldn't see it. Would I have lived my whole life not knowing? Would that have been better? I don't think so. The truth would have come out eventually. Family secrets always do. And discovering it at 70 would have been worse than discovering it at 31. At least now I had time to rebuild, to create a new identity, to make something of the wreckage. The bracelet is just a piece of plastic, yellowed with age, with a name and a date printed on it. But it changed my life completely. It led me to Patricia, to Jennifer, to the truth about Elizabeth. It destroyed my family and helped me build new connections. It took away my certainty and gave me authenticity instead. Fair trade? I still didn't know, but it was the trade I'd gotten, and I was learning to live with it, to maybe even be grateful for it, in my own complicated way. I got married last year. Not the man I was seeing when Claire got engaged, but someone else, someone I met through my work. He understood trauma because he treated it professionally. We had long conversations about identity and truth and the complicated nature of family. He'd met all my mothers, Elizabeth in spirit, Patricia in person, even Jennifer once when she visited. He said he loved that I came with a whole story, not just a simple narrative. He loved my complexity, my ability to hold contradictions. I loved that he saw me clearly and chose me anyway. We talked about having children. I was terrified of it. What if I turned out like Elizabeth, so desperate for control that I did terrible things? What if I passed down trauma to my kids, damaged them in ways I couldn't anticipate? My therapist said those fears proved I wouldn't be like Elizabeth. I was self-aware enough to worry, to question, to seek help. That self-awareness was protective. I wanted to believe that. I was trying to believe it. Maybe one day I'd be ready. Maybe not. Either way was okay. My life now was nothing like I'd imagined 4 years ago. It was built on a different foundation, shaped by truth instead of lies. It wasn't easier or harder, just different, more authentic. I knew who I was, or at least I was learning. I knew where I came from, even though the answer was complicated. I had relationships that were real, built on honesty, even when honesty was painful. I had work that mattered, that helped people like me. I had a future that was mine to choose. That was something. It was everything. The final truth was this. Elizabeth Hartley stole me. She stole Claire. She built a family on crime and deception. She hurt multiple women and changed the course of multiple lives without permission. What she did was unforgivable, wrong in every possible way. There was no justification, no excuse, no mitigating factor that made it acceptable. She was, in that act, monstrous. That was the truth, and I would never pretend otherwise. Her crimes were real and devastating and permanent. But also this, Elizabeth Hartley loved me. She raised me with patience and care. She showed up to my school plays, helped with my homework, comforted me when I was sad. She taught me to be kind, to work hard, to think critically. She shaped me in fundamental ways, gave me tools and values that I still carried. Her love was real, even though its origin was tainted. That was also true, and I wouldn't pretend otherwise either. Both things existed. Both things mattered. I lived in the space between those truths now, in the tension between honoring the mother who raised me and acknowledging the crimes she committed, in the gap between gratitude for the life I'd had and anger about the life I'd been stolen from. There was no resolution to that tension, no way to make it clean or simple. But I'd learned that life didn't need to be clean or simple. It just needed to be real, honestly lived, moving forward one day at a time into whatever came next. That was enough. After everything, I'd finally found peace in knowing it was enough.